Copyright in these lectures is either owned by the ANU or a third party who has licensed the ANU to use it. Students may use the recording for personal study only. No lecture may be communicated online, copied or shared without the prior permission of the ANU.
Our topic today is New Rules of Business 2020 and Beyond. As we all know, the world we're confronted with now is changing rapidly. Many traditional business models will be replaced overnight or have been replaced overnight. IT, manufacturing, finance, or even entertainment. No matter what industry you want to step into after your graduation, you need to be aware of the current trend within that industry. So our host lecturer, Richard, the co-founder of Platform, which is a growing consultancy service of the future of work, will share his inspirations of how we could prepare individuals, organizations, and even communities to succeed in the changing society. If you have any questions during the lecture, you can post that directly on Wattle, and we can discuss that later in Q&A session. So my job's done. Richard, the stage is yours.
Thanks, Jerome. Thank you, and welcome. In terms of today, very much would like to make this as sort of interactive as we possibly can make it. So if anyone has questions throughout the 45 minutes, I'm more than happy to answer those as we go along. And I'm also happy to sort of share with you some further insights and answer any other questions afterwards as well. Just for your information, my background, I used to be the head of innovation across NAB's Business Bank for a couple of years. And my sort of perspective on innovation was that innovation was all about people, mindset, empathy, cognitive diversity, and technology was simply a tool. And I think there tends to be a prevailing narrative that it's all about technology. And my view is that technology is a tool to potentially solve problems. So that's a fundamentally sort of different approach to what tends to prevail, particularly across Australian corporations at the moment. And as Jeremy said, the world's changing, and the driver for the change really is the rise of networks and the internet. And if we sort of think about it, the internet has fundamentally changed the nature in society completely over the last 20 or 30 years. And initially, prior to the internet, we had this thing called reality, which was just the physical world that we inhabit. And with the internet, we ended up with this thing called virtual reality, or this sort of digital world. And who you are on the internet could be fundamentally different to who you were in real life. And up until a few years ago, those two worlds were almost sort of dual worlds. They weren't sort of connected. And the simplest way I describe Industry 4.0, and there's so many different definitions and ways to describe it, people talk about singularity and Moore's law and technology, but I tend to sort of simplify it and say it's really the convergence of the digital and the physical world. So these two worlds are no longer separate. So what you potentially do online has real-life consequences, and what you do physically potentially has an impact online. And that changes everything. It changes the economics of business. It changes how we think about privacy. I mean, this notion that we can somehow containerize and control our privacy or our identity is a fallacy. There's so much information out there on us, and information by its very nature wants to be free. So there is a need to sort of fundamentally rethink regulation. And then there's a big question around, we talk about AI and artificial intelligence and these systems, these pieces of software, but I would actually argue the bigger question is, what are the impacts of these complex systems on reality? So, thinking about it from a system and a complexity perspective. And we're seeing with Facebook, for example, that no one really knows what the answer is. No one really knows where this is going to go. And we can sort of sit here and hypothesize and make laws to control it, but the reality is that it's a complex system. I mean, it was hard enough before we had digital. You know, there's people like George Soros and people that have really thought a lot about what is reality and the difference between the natural world and how we perceive that world. So that was then, but now we've now got this extra dimension around virtual reality. And what does that mean? And what does that virtual reality mean to reality? And what does reality mean to virtual reality? So there's some incredible opportunities in this space. There's a company, and its name escapes me, but I'm happy to send through a whole range of links post this presentation, but it's a company that's emerged out of New York. I think it's worth about $15 or $20 billion. And it was founded by two philosophers. And what their modus operandi is that we've got these, you know, there's a real focus around digital data and insight. But that digital data and insight doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And what they've done is they're using AI machine learning, but then they're also using human contextualization and understanding to bridge that digital reality and reality. So there are a whole bunch of philosophers that have sort of come together. It's quite a divergent people. There's computer scientists, engineers, but there's also sociologists and philosophers that have brought this business together, and they've got some major clients in the US. So this opportunity, not just within the virtual world and the physical world, but in those organisations that somehow bring those two worlds together, is an opportunity in itself. And I think we'll start seeing increasingly these sort of companies that can straddle those two worlds. The reason I put this up is that, you know, again, the prevailing narrative around Industry 4.0 is all about singularity. It's all about Moore's law. It's all about exponential increases in memory and so forth. But what about the social dimensions? What about the inequality? What about the stagnation? What about the response through popularism and so forth to some of these systems? So what I'm saying about this is that we really need to sort of think about this as a complex, interconnected system. And we need people that sort of think about things in a system-based way and don't just sort of think about technology in isolation. You know, the level of homelessness, for example, in San Francisco is going through the roof. What's the obligation on those Silicon Valley companies to address some of those issues? And a lot of these companies have come from really noble ideas around saving the world and changing the world, but there's a whole range of externalities that are arising through the embracement of these technologies. You know, what's the point of launching a transport as a platform business where the economic value goes to a couple of shareholders and people are sort of living hand to mouth? So this is we need leaders that sort of think about this in a system-based way. There's a lady by the name of Nora Bateson. She's an anthropologist. You know, we talk about big data. There's a concept called warm data, which is social data, but she talks about warm data. And warm data is a bit like the semantic web in sort of computer science engineering terms. It's the relationship between that data. All information is sort of interconnected. David Deutsch talks about this. You know, this notion that we just study computer science and we can navigate the world. The world doesn't work like that. All knowledge is interconnected. So we actually need people to, you know, go deep in terms of understanding a discipline, but we also need people to then go broad and be able to sort of make sense of what's going on beyond simply their undergraduate degree. And that requires a fundamentally different person. So I was having a chat with some people before this lecture, and I've got on my phone, I've literally got about 300 podcasts that I listen to, and I sense and scan, and they include everything from arts and architecture to AI machine learning through to philosophy to politics. And I think it's really important that when you sort of try to make sense of what's going on, you take a really broad approach. You read broadly. And I think podcasts are an amazing way to get long-form insights, you know, rather than just the Twitter snapshot. So this little chart, and it's not that clear, but it's more about sort of illustrating what's playing out. It's really showing the shift in the top 100 global companies since 2008. And the green circles are those companies that didn't, that weren't within that top 100 in 2008. So within 10 years, almost 55–60% of those companies have been completely disrupted. So that rate of change is sort of accelerating, and new companies are being formed all the time, and traditional companies are struggling, I suppose, to adapt to this change. This sort of takes it to another level. It talks about, you know, the rise of some of the key companies out of China. It talks about energy companies and technology companies and finance companies. So what's going on? I mean, the way I try to make sense of it is that there's four sort of drivers that are sort of washing around in this bowl of soup that are all mixing up together. One's around tech, you know, technology innovation, the rise of cloud computing, neural nets, AI, blockchain. I've got a question around blockchain, but we'll sort of park that there. Then we've also got social value shifts. So how is society fundamentally changing? You know, what is the role of an organisation or a corporation? What is the role of community? You know, one of the big issues that's emerging now is the rate of mental illness across our community. What's the connection to being in contact with other humans and that social connection? We've also got the economic realities that we're in a world of increasing debt, which I'll get to in a minute. So the instability and the interconnectedness of the global financial system is creating issues. And then we've got a whole range of issues just around environmental sustainability in terms of using the world's natural resources and ensuring that we have a sustainable planet. So all those things are sort of washing around, and people are trying to sort of make sense of those things. And if you sort of think about, if innovation is all about solving problems, there's tremendous numbers of problems to be solved, so there's tremendous numbers of opportunities for entrepreneurs and people that want to solve problems. So it's a great time to be alive, to be solving some of these problems. It's really sort of fascinating when you sort of think about the difference in the way people on the East and West Coast are talking about the future. So on the East Coast, you've got MIT Digital Lab, you've got a number of universities there that are thinking a lot more about the social and society issues of what's playing out. And the West Coast tends to be enamoured by the tech. And I think they're both right, but I think it's also important to sort of think deeply around some of those social issues. And one of the people that I've been following for quite a few years is a gentleman by the name of Dr. Otto Scharmer from MIT. And he has this theory that there's this increasing range of imbalances in our systems. And he's thought deeply as an economist as to why this is playing out. And his conclusion is that a lot of this comes down to how we individually see the world. You know, every economics course that you go to talks about maximising utility or maximising value, which is very much anchored in yourself. But what's the point of maximising your interest if the system collapses? So his theory U, talks about moving from the ecosystem, which is all about self-interest, to the ecosystem, which is how do we think in a system-based way around solving some of those issues. This is just a couple of different graphs that are playing out as we speak. The first one on the left is debt. So the level of global debt has actually increased by about 65% since the GFC. A lot of that debt's now sitting within the public sector globally, and it's also sitting within the shadow banking system, which is the debt capital markets, private markets, and so forth. So that increasing debt creates instability, and it actually breaks down the traditional way of looking at finance. So interest rates no longer matter And we've sort of gone from using interest rates as a lever to drive the economy to this concept called quantitative easing, which is all about reducing the long end of the interest rate curve through buying bonds. And we're about to move into the third phase of that, which is around monetisation of that debt, where some of the central banks around the world will simply fund government spending. Now, there's different views as to where this ends, but it's a real issue, and some of those traditional ways of looking at how the economy works are breaking down. The second one, there's a gentleman, Geoffrey West, he's a physicist out of the UK. He's written a book in the last couple of years called Scale. And it sort of challenges this sort of notion that we can have this sort of exponential growth in systems, that they just continually increase at a compound 3 to 5, 7% year on year. And he's saying that that's not the way the world works. If you look at nature, you look at organisms, you look at cities, you look at economies, you look at companies. No company has this sort of exponential, perpetual growth. I just think it's something to always sort of have in the back of your mind when you hear these stories of these incredible scale-ups and unicorns and startups that are doing these amazing things, that there is a limit to this, and we need to sort of just take a pause and sort of think about that. And then the last thing is really just around that social equality. So I think if we look at the world on a global basis, the level of social inequalities actually, and the people that have sort of moved out of poverty, it's been an amazing story over the last 10 or 15 years. The issues are more within the country. So if you look at the US, that division between the east and west coast and the middle of the US has created that response. So, what we do also has social implications. And to sort of just think about this as a tech narrative or a finance narrative without sort of thinking about the social implications is very dangerous. In 2015, a gentleman by the name of Nick Gowing and Chris Langton, I think Nick used to be the editor of the Financial Times in the UK, went out to 100 senior executives in the UK, and asked them, under Chatham House rules, how are they coping with all this change? And there was 9 consistent responses that came back from these 100 senior executives across the public sector, the NGO and private sector. They included being overwhelmed by multiple intense pressures, the need for institutional conformity, willful blindness, groupthink, risk aversion, fear of career-limiting moves, reactionary mindsets, denial and cognitive overload and dissonance. So what I think Nick's saying with this survey is that the nature of leadership has fundamentally changed in the 21st century, yet our leaders aren't necessarily equipped to deal with this change. And that's really the genesis, I suppose, of CoLab 4, is that we've been set up very much to support people, organisations and communities navigate the fourth industrial revolution. And too often we focus on the what, which is the tech, and we don't necessarily focus on the why, which is the people. And organisations are people that deal with people that deal with people. And I think I use the analogy, it feels to me like we've built this 2019 Red Bull racing car, but we haven't actually invested in driver training. So we've come up with 5 maps or a compass to sort of make sense of what's going on. And the 5 things that I think every organisation really needs to think about is how does strategy shift in this new world, business strategy or organisational strategy? What are the new business models that start emerging? How does decision-making change in a world of complexity and uncertainty? How do organisations' culture and design change? And what does leadership, management and skills look like in this new world? And really just trying to sort of simplify this complexity in these sort of 5 or 6 pillars that we've come up with is just a simple way of people to start making sense of what's going on. So the first map around strategy. So if you think about the internet, what used to happen in the 20th century was that you produce a product or service, you've got distribution, and you've got customers. And what used to happen was that a number of companies, they used to combine a product and service with distribution, supply-side economies. So what they would do is, I produce beer, I need to form a relationship with a pub. I do newspapers, I need news agents. And they would combine these, and this would sort of create this sort of business model. Now, the internet changes all that completely, because what the internet does is that the transactional cost falls to zero, the ability to personalise your product starts falling to zero, the marginal cost of communicating starts falling to zero, the marginal cost of collaboration falls to zero. So the whole economics of how business operates fundamentally shifts. And particularly in Australia, we're still sort of caught in this sort of industrial age mindset that we produce things and then we distribute those things. Whereas in China, within the US, other parts of Southeast Asia, they're focusing on building platforms and ecosystems to support communities because they understand what's going on. And that's a fundamentally different way of looking at the world. And it's more about how do you then build that community and then support that community through value. So the rules of value have changed as well. So if I'm Huawei and I want to compete with Apple with an iPhone, I have to build an incredibly contemporary phone. I have to build incredibly contemporary software. But then I need to find a whole bunch of third parties that can actually provide value on that phone for the customer. So the value is not just about my product or service, it's the value of the ecosystem. So McKinsey's have actually come out and said that by 2025, 30+% of the global economy, $60 trillion of trade, will be ecosystems. And Australia is sort of really lagging in that space. The other thing that's happening, and it sort of goes back to what I spoke about before around system complexity and sustainability, we're also seeing the rise from a social perspective of things like B Corps, which are very much focused around, the B Corps philosophy is very much around ensuring that all the stakeholders in an organisation needs are met. So shareholders, staff, customers, suppliers, the broader community. Which sort of goes back to the way that organisations used to work before Milton Friedman came out in 1970 and said the purpose of the firm was to maximise shareholder value. So there's a rise, there's this massive increase globally of B Corps. And that's actually a point of difference in terms of how different organisations are actually operating. So what are some of the areas that are ripe for disruption? There's trust. There's a company called Whitecoat. And what Whitecoat did, it's an Australian company, about 3 years ago, they came out with this idea that we want to amplify the voice of the customer in the health sector. So they came out with a website where you as a patient could actually rate your doctor or your health practitioner. Now initially there was a huge backlash from the industry around that approach. 3 years down the track, there's a whole bunch of doctors and health practitioners actually putting on their websites and their Whitecoat page, their LinkedIn details and customer testimonials. So simply by exposing that information around the customer is a way to fundamentally change the industry and build trust. A second company is Octopus, which is reimagining energy in the UK around renewable energy, which is addressing some of those system imbalances. We've got Uber, which is focusing on taking out friction. Now there's a paradox between friction and trust. That there's a lady by the name of Rachel Botsman, and she teaches at Oxford, and her view is that all trust is a human dimension, and there's 4 dimensions to trust. There's reliability, capability, benevolence, and integrity. And that actually requires time because it's a relationship between 2 human sort of agents. So this notion that we can somehow code trust through a blockchain. You know, it almost sort of challenges some of that notion, or this notion that we need to reduce friction. You know, Airbnb have actually added friction to their service process because it builds trust. So what I'm trying to say is that we need individuals that understand technology, but also understand those human components to the technology. It's when you sort of bring those together that you have this sort of radical exchange of ideas and some really amazing innovation. WeWork, they're about to list on the NASDAQ. They're focused, you know, what they're doing is converting CapEx to OpEx. So accommodation as a service. Why rent a building when you can rent space? You know, there's so many examples of that. Software as a service. Go get car sharing. There's a whole bunch of examples there. I've put TPG, which is an Australian telco, in terms of transparency and complexity. So they really built their business model around simplifying complexity. So they came out with these all-you-can-eat data packages and so forth, which fundamentally changed the market. And then Netflix, you know, the way it's disintermediated the traditional pay TV companies. So there's lots of opportunities around how do you start addressing some of these existing system problems to build new businesses that that play into the shifts underway. I spoke about this before, so I won't sort of continue, but we're actually moving from this sort of supply side to demand side economies. So what does that mean? So it means that television goes to YouTube, it means that universities go to MOOCs, it means that banks go to peer-to-peer lending, it means that car manufacturing goes to car sharing, it means that music goes to music streaming. There's loads and loads of examples of emerging businesses that through using network architecture have fundamentally changed the nature of business. And if you sort of think about this in a deeper way, you know, one of the reasons why firms or organisations sort of came into existence in the 20th century through the Industrial Revolution was because it was all about scale, it was about mass production. It was around functional silos, it was around operational efficiency. It was around bringing people together to communicate. And Esko Kilpie has sort of written about this at length, but he talks about how with the internet, the nature of those costs and the nature of engagement fundamentally changes. So do you really need an organisation to deliver different services, or could you simply do that through a network? And what does that mean? So I'll give you a quick example of an example. One of the gentlemen that set up this company, I used to work with at NAB, and what Athena is doing is they've launched their home loan product, and they want to reimagine home loans in the Australian marketplace. So what they've done is they've spoken to a whole range of industry super funds that have pools of capital, and they've got a whole bunch of consumers that want home loans, and they've just built a digital platform that connects those two together. There's no bank sitting in the middle. You know, banks are running cost-to-income ratios of 47%. So how can a traditional bank compete against an Athena that's simply connecting the producers of the product with the users of the product? So that to me is a really tangible example of some of the disruption that's playing out. So sort of thinking about how does this sort of network, this new technology, and these new rules of business change the nature of how you operate. Seth Godin, amazing, he's got a blog site, he writes a lot of books on marketing and so forth, but he talks about marketing is no longer about stuff, it's about stories. So I think even marketing is being sort of disrupted. And if you think about Nike last year with this campaign. I mean, this was actually quite a provocative campaign because, you know, there was a level of dissent, you know, with this sort of campaign. It was actually going to divide the population, but they've actually taken a position against that, and it's actually been quite successful for Nike. But again, there's no shoes in that ad. It's about a story. In this world, you know, the way that we sort of think about mobile behaviour changes. There's a fantastic book by a professor at Stern University called TAP. It talks about the 9 drivers to mobile behaviour, including context, location, time, weather, saliency, crowdness, trajectory, social dynamics and tech mix. Just a simple example of that, people in crowded train stations tend to shop more on e-commerce sites. People, when the weather's sunny, tend to buy more on e-commerce sites. So there's all these sort of new emerging behaviours that are sort of coming out of this. How are we going for time? Okay. I spoke about this before, but you know, again, the rise of ecosystems. Again, this is a bit of a mud map around North America, Asia, Europe, Latin America, and Africa. Clearly the 2 standouts are Asia and North America. So companies like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Apple, SoftBank, Alibaba, Tencent, JD.com. So I use this concept called the channel, or this term called the channel changes the business model. So how does the new technology or the new channel change the nature of business? And if you think about Uber, Uber could never have existed if you didn't have ubiquitous internet, a mobile phone and GPS. I mean, they were the 3 sort of core ingredients to making that work. So what does that mean for different businesses, and what are traditional organisations doing to reimagine their business with this sort of logic and this sort of thinking? Lyft. Late last year, Lyft announced they were coming out with a $2.99 subscription service in the US. So for $2.99 per month, you get 30 rides every 30 days. So they're no longer selling a single ride, they're selling a subscription to rides. What was fascinating about this is they did a proof of concept in one state in the US, and they scaled it within 4 weeks to the entire US. And within 2 months, Uber had done the same thing. So the rate of change is so fast. Volvo. Why sell cars when you can sell subscriptions? So their all new S60 motor vehicle in the US, they're selling it as a $600 per month subscription. If you don't like it, you just can't pay. Rent the Runway. I think they've got 8 million women across the US that are just renting clothes. The Netflix of women's clothing. Why buy dresses when you can rent a dress? And this is another one that I really like, is around the disaggregation of software. So it reminds me of, there's a great podcast, again, I'm happy to share it with everyone, talking about when Henry Ford started building motor vehicles, he had to go and find silicon for the glass, he had to find rubber for the tyres and metal for the chassis, and basically do the entire thing. And then over 20 or 30 years, you had a supply chain. And you had Corningware doing glass and Bridgestone doing the tyres. That supply chain, we would call it an ecosystem, but back then they called it a supply chain. If you think about what's now going on with software, we're going from software to apps to APIs. So there are businesses that are just an API. I'd love to see some Australian versions of API business models. So Twilio, SendGrid are API business models. There's a company called SigOpt, which was founded by a Bayesian statistics optimization expert. Now the problem with Bayesian statistics optimization experts is it's very difficult to scale. So he basically built an API that sort of codified his logic. And he's now, Andreessen Horowitz have invested in him. And he rolls this SIGOP API out to machine learning models, and they improve their outcomes by anywhere from 10x to 100x. So how many Australian businesses, how many global businesses are actually embracing API-based business models? It's also sort of moving beyond this, right? So Wonder School. So Wonder School was founded by two people in the west coast of the US that were struggling with the cost of property in San Francisco and LA and places like that. So rather than have the teachers having to find these properties, what they basically came up with was this concept of a childcare centre in a box. And Wonder School provides all the picks and shovels for those businesses to sort of succeed. So they provide everything from their billing systems, their accounting systems, their marketing, their operational health and safety systems. And they're basically just focused on a vertical business and basically taken it into the 21st century and digitised that and created a generation of micro-entrepreneurs. You know, when Jeff Bezos announced a few months ago that he wanted to compete against UPS in logistics, and he announced he signed a deal for 22,000 motor cars with Daimler-Benz, Amazon won't be owning those 22,000 motor vehicles. There'll be 22,000 micro-entrepreneurs that are running their own business that access the Amazon platform. You don't have to, like, the logic is fundamentally different. And it's how do you use those technologies to do that? And at the same time, create this generation of micro-entrepreneurs. I mean, the average income, my understanding of Wonder School, of a teacher is something like $150,000 US. So we're actually creating this generation of micro-entrepreneurs and addressing these social inequality issues. Now, these business models, to me, are far more sustainable than the sort of prevailing, narrative around online advertising and, some of the internet businesses that we see, which tend to be more, it's probably the only business model I've ever come across where the customer is your product. An Australian example, same concepts, company called Bright. A lady, she used to be at Macquarie Bank. She used to be very senior in their leasing division. She left Macquarie to set up a startup 3 years ago called Bright. The first thing she did was built a digital credit approval app that she could hand out to 400 installers of solar panels around Sydney and Melbourne. So when they're out and seeing a client and the client's making a decision around installing a $30,000 solar system, they can give them an answer within 8 seconds in 85% of cases. But the key with this is that by building the marketplace, it also changes the value proposition with the customer. So the customer does not pay any interest on the solar loan because the installer is basically using the marketplace to originate new business. So the sharing of value in that system fundamentally changes. So how does a traditional bank compete against Bright when you're charging interest? They can't. So the rules of business are fundamentally shifting. I'm sort of conscious of time. We're running out a bit of time, but I'll just go through a couple of things and we'll just wrap it up. In a world of complexity and uncertainty, we need to collaborate, we need to work together, we need to bring diverse people together. So, corporate innovation ecosystems is a way in which you can start bringing together these divergent voices to solve problems. I'm having some discussions right now in Sydney around building such a system in certain sectors and bring together, people from the NGO sector together with government, together with the private sector to work together. But that requires people that can sort of cope with ambiguity and uncertainty, because I'm not sure what's going to come out of this, but all I know is that if we sort of come together and share insights and work together, we'll start solving problems. So there's a really good example of this in Toronto in Canada called Mars. It's an amazing ecosystem. It's been going, I think, for 15 or 20 years, and they're doing some incredible things around building new 21st century businesses. And I could sort of go on, but I won't, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, the next part is Q&A session. You can raise any question related to today's topic.
Hi, Charlie. Thanks for talking. And you raised 5 new rules for business. And when you run your own business, how will you use these 5 rules?
That's a very good. So part of it is, when I left NAB, I don't have any income coming through. I'm facing into uncertainty. So we've had lots of conversations and different things have emerged out of that. So part of it is, the minimum viable product that we're building has been shaped through our customer interactions. So for example, one of the things we're doing in August is we're bringing out to Australia a group from Holland called the Corporate Rebels, which have gone around the world to look at organisational design and culture. And we've partnered with the Institute of Chartered Accountants, Australia and New Zealand, and Venture Cafe to do that. So again, we're sort of thinking about listening and observing and then pivoting as we're building the business. We're also thinking about building a digital marketplace and a few other things as well. So again, I think that's really important. And in terms of the organisational design piece, we've just set up an advisory board, and we have the ex-chair of a major listed company on board, but the rest of the team, the advisory board, are people from 22 to 25 years of age that come from a whole range of different backgrounds. One's a psychologist, one's a data scientist, one's a software engineer. So again, it's really sort of turning upside down corporate boards, because in a lot of cases, a number of these people on these boards aren't necessarily equipped to understand what's going on. So you're absolutely right. We need to be living and embracing this, and we're starting to apply some of those disciplines.
Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, this one there.
You said that there was, you pointed to inequality as a problem, and in a lot of cases I feel like the advent of technology companies have made it worse. So do you think it's the responsibility of the technology companies or the government to regulate or to tax them and implement a universal basic income or something like that?
I think it's a multi-dimensional complex problem. But I also think that, there's Mark Benioff, for example, the CEO of Salesforce. He's been quite vocal on some of those issues in San Francisco. I also think we've got to sort of fundamentally think differently around what's the role of government. The narrative that tends to prevail at the moment is that we see them as an enabler or facilitator, when there's a role for the government to be an actor in this, so actually being an active participant in innovation. So if you think about what happened with DARPA in the US, that was a really strong connection between the US government and the US Defence Department. So we need to change the way that we see government. And we also need to sort of, there's a lady, Mariana Mazzucato, she's written this book called The Value of Everything, and she talks about mission-driven innovation. So government's really well placed, just like the universities are, to take a longer-term view and deal with that uncertainty. So what are the big areas that we want to focus on as a country over the next 5, 10, 15 years? So, for example, a lot of countries around the world now have an AI strategy and are throwing huge amounts of money and resources around AI. What is Australia's perspective on AI? What's our position? Because the world's fundamentally changing around us. And I think as we move through the 21st century, if you think about the industrial age was driven through energy. It was thermodynamics of converting fuel into heat and power and energy, and that drove the economies, and there's actually a really strong correlation between that process and the economic prosperity of some of those countries. in the 21st century, my view is that the key driver of economic prosperity will be knowledge. So how well does a country actually convert information into knowledge? And again, I think our leaders and our, there's a number of people that we're just not having that conversation as a country, but it is a multi-dimensional complex problem, and it requires a whole range of stakeholders to address that inequality issue.
Thank you.
That's it. No more questions? Yep.
How do you think about AI? Because now AI is very, very popular, and the industry think they can do many things. But as people in computer science, and also if we do research in AI, and maybe we think AI is just a statistic and some basic math, and but how do you think? We think it's not a magic, but why is it so popular?
I think AI to me is a way to build complex code, but at the same, and it's a pattern recognition machine. I think even the word AI, I have this notion of artificial intelligence. I have a fundamental issue with. It's not can't be artificial intelligence. It's statistics. It's gradient descent. It's neural nets. It's so the whole language around it. So it definitely has a role, and I think we would be foolish not to be sort of embracing it. But what it also raises to me an important issue around people that have the capacity to actually ask the question, is the output right for the future we want to create? So my undergraduate degree is in accounting finance, and the guy go garbage in, garbage out. I actually think that areas like cybersecurity will be fought in the 21st century on areas like the integrity of data. Because if you're using the wrong, digesting the wrong data in these systems, you're actually going to get these answers. So we live in a complex, uncertain world, and this notion that we can somehow predict the future is a sophism. It doesn't. It's never worked, and it will never work. The world is far too complex. So they are tools that can actually assist us improve efficiency and automation and things like that. But we also need to build a whole new social policy and fabric around that. There's a gentleman, Moshe Vardi. He's an Israeli computer scientist, and he asked this question 3 months ago. Technology is driving the future, but who is doing the steering? So where is again, it feels like we're just building these things without sort of asking some deeper questions. And that's why I think it's these people that can sort of play at the intersection of the technology and also recognise these other dimensions around values and compass and why we do what we do that will be best equipped to deal with this. But it's a useful tool, but it's going to result in a whole range of externalities that we never even contemplated when we did that. And then when you start scaling it, which is what's happening now, it's not just the AI, it's how all the AI then sort of comes together to create a system that we never really understood how that was going to play out.
So due to the time limit, we can only have one more question.
Actually, I have a question here.
Yep.
Because I just see currently Australia suffers the economic stagnation problem. And maybe the big companies may be strong enough to withstand this, but how could the micro enterprises leaders overcome such a problem, and when they are lacking the funding support?
Yep. So there's a company called Food Innovation Australia Limited, and Food Innovation Australia is owned by the federal government. It's a federal government agency. And what they've been trying to do is support Australian food producers export globally. And for 10 years or 15 years, they would do all these tours overseas, and they would have these events, and it wasn't actually having any impact. And secondly, a lot of these organisations are too small to to go into these markets by themselves. They just don't have the financial resources to put salespeople in different countries around the world. They just don't have the size. So what Food Innovation Australia was all about was creating a platform where those companies could sort of plug into their platform and then use their sales teams and service teams to go into new markets. So I think there's a huge opportunity here to recognise that the